There they are, A-20s, the most powerful light bombers in the world. We call them Havocs. The RAF call them Bostons. And the Luftwaffe, well, they just know they're poison. But wherever they fly and under what name they're known, they're still a twin-engine bundle of dynamite. Trim, sleek, fast, powerful, and deadly. Although they first took wing as light bombers, they've proved themselves so versatile in the air that they now perform every type of combat duty and under every type of flying condition. That's why they're playing such a vital role in giving the United Nations supremacy in the air. Flown by the RAF, the A-20 contributed more than its share in the ultimate defeat of Rommel in Libya. Without the attacking power of their Bostons, the British would have been forced to retreat in Palestine. With German divisions only 15 miles away, greatly outnumbered in every department, the British sent out 25 Boston bombers on over 100 sorties daily. So effectively were the enemy blasted that the British were able to regroup their forces and counterattack. Yes, the Luftwaffe was beaten in Africa, just as it will be beaten eventually in every theater of operation. And these smashed Nazi planes bear mute evidence to the mastery of the A-20. Here are hundreds of them destroyed at one Nazi airbase, no longer master of all they surveyed, wrecked, smashed, and beaten to the ground. But victories like that don't happen overnight. Victories won with squadrons of A-20s that leave a trail of enemy wreckage in their wake. These men learned the how, why, and wherefore back home. And from the looks of things, they learned their job well. And this is how they do it.
These A-20s are sure queer-looking gals, aren't they?
Maybe, Tom. But over in Egypt, they look like glamour gals to us. Matter of fact, we thought they were the best-looking babies that had been up and down the Nile since Cleopatra retired.
Cleopatra, huh?
Yep.
Welcome to Scale Model Workshop, and the first part of my series on constructing the AMT A-20 Havoc. In this series, I'll be converting the AMT A-20 B and C kit into an A-20A, as it was used by the 5th Air Force in the Pacific Theater during the early stages of World War II. The 89th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bomb Group arrived in Brisbane, Australia in February 1942 and assembled in Townsville. In March, they moved to their first base at Charters Towers. Here the 89th received their first A-20s. These were the early A models. In fact, some of these aircraft the group had flown back in the States during training. While at Charters Towers, these aircraft were given a makeover by the legendary Paul Pappy gun. To increase the A-20's limited range, a 450-gallon fuel tank was installed in the forward bomb bay. 450 caliber machine guns were mounted in the nose, and new honeycomb bomb racks were constructed to handle stacked rows of 23-pound parafrag bombs. The parafrag bomb was a small fragmentation bomb fitted with a parachute. The parachute allowed the bombs to be dropped at an extremely low level and give the aircraft time to clear the area. In this configuration, the 89th was now equipped with the 1st Pacific Strafers. In August of 1942, the 89th moved up to its permanent base at 3 Mile Strip near Port Moresby. The modified A-20s proved so successful that General Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, ordered the B-25s to be modified in a similar fashion. Kenny was also instrumental in convincing Douglas and North American to develop similar factory versions of the 5th's field modifications. Externally, the A-20A and C were very similar, the differences usually being the vents cut into the cowl and the single exhaust stacks. The vents were found to be ineffective and were eliminated early on, while the single exhaust stacks were eliminated early in the C production. AMT first released the A-20 B and C kit in 1994. It was followed by the P-70, the A-20G, and finally the J. 3 of the kits were later re-released under the Italeri label, and Revell released it with both the G and J nose in the same kit. My experience has been that the Italeri moldings of the larger parts are cleaner than the originals from AMT, but curiously many of the smaller parts didn't fare as well. With less than 100 parts, it's pretty basic, but I think it's one of the best vintage AMT aircraft kits, with good overall dimensions and shape, and it soldiers on as the only 48 scale A-20 to date. Over the years there have been a fair amount of aftermarket bits offered for this kit, but outside of a couple of exceptions, I want to stick to the kit as much as possible, and use this project as an opportunity to combine many of the techniques and concepts that I've talked about in separate videos. One final note before I get into the construction. I've put up several web pages related to the construction, as well as some reference and historical material that I found helpful. In particular, I think you'll find the select images from the history of the 89th Bomb Squadron especially poignant. You can find the links in the video description below. I almost always build my 48 scale model aircraft with their wheels up, because I prefer to see the aircraft in the environment for which they were intended, and I think 48 scale is just the right size to represent both their characteristics as well as their overall design features when viewed at a comfortable distance, and in my case that usually means hanging from the ceiling. Because the model will be all buttoned up, interior detail in this scale isn't usually a big priority for me, but in combat, half the early A-20's gunner stations open, so I thought it would be a good idea to include some interior detail in that area. I also added a couple of crew figures which required some adjustments and corrections to the kit's interior. The basis for the crew figures was the set of Navy pilots and deck crew from Tamiya, and with a judicious amount of transplant, orthopedic, head and neck, as well as actual plastic surgery, the figures were adapted to their positions. The A-20 cockpit isn't considered spacious, and the pilot needs to be positioned so that he appears like this relative to the canopy framing. To get the pilot in the proper position, the kit seat needed to be moved down and forward. Once the basic position of the pilot was established, the control column was relocated and the pilot's arms were attached. This is the final position. Here you can get an idea of the prominence of the pilot figure and the limited visibility of the rest of the cockpit, especially when viewed through plastic and canopy framing. So modifying the kit's supplied sidewall detail seemed sufficient enough to fill in the space.
A lot of hardware down there.
The kit provides very little in the way of detail for the gunner's compartment, and I wasn't able to find any definitive reference material that covers this area adequately, so I was forced to piece the limited information together as best I could. On my website, I put up a collection of compartment details gathered from several early flight manuals, and there are some excellent images from Phil Meade posted on the Aussie Modeler website. I have links to both of these in the video description. In U.S. Army Air Force service, the A-20 A was fitted with twin, box-fed .30 caliber Browning machine guns in an upper mount, similar to the SBD Dauntless. This consists of a skate ring anchored to fore and aft beams that run along each side of the gunner's compartment opening. The mount assembly is fitted with a folding mechanism that allows the guns to be lowered and stowed when the compartment canopy is closed. There was also a single .30 caliber machine gun in a flexible ventral mount that could be folded into place and fired through a retractable panel. In addition to the upper and lower gun mounts, the early A-20 gunner's compartment was equipped with emergency flight controls. In theory, the controls were supposed to allow the gunner to stabilize the aircraft in case the pilot became disabled and the crew needed to bail out. These were eliminated in the later G models with the power turret. Out of the box, the kit has a large void formed by the wing root. There's no detail on the compartment sides. The compartment insert does have the rudder pedals and some faint stick detail molded into the bulkhead. The upper portion of the forward partition will need to be cut down. The ring mount's a bit on the thick side, and it's mounted a little too high in relation to the upper edge of the compartment opening. However, the fore and aft placement's pretty good. An AMT did make an attempt to simulate the beam that runs transversely behind the mount. From all accounts, it seems that the gunner needed to stand in order to effectively use the upper mount, and in doing so, he pretty much obliterates the view of most of the interior detail. Fabricating the detail, as well as fitting in the gunner figure, proved a lot more challenging than I had originally envisioned, and it took several attempts before I figured out a workable approach, with something of what I considered a reasonable compromise. During the process, it became clear that I had to let the position of the gunner figure and mount dictate what I needed to modify or eliminate, and not get hung up agonizing over details that I felt wouldn't really add to the story. To cover over the wing root depression, I planned on sheathing the sidewalls with 10,000-inch styrene, but because the material is so thin and flexible, it needed to be supported to prevent it from deforming into the depression. To me, a tape was applied to the bulkhead in the area of the depression, and a mixture of acrylic powder and cyanoacrylate cement was flowed into the area. When set, the bulkhead was removed, and the excess was trimmed away with a knife. Here you can see how well the support follows the bulkhead. I think the kit floor is positioned a bit too far above the bottom of the fuselage, so it won't accommodate a scale 5'10" standing figure. It seemed like I'd either need to modify the kit compartment floor or create a gunner named Stumpy. Turned out I needed to do a little of both. I couldn't find any reference for the tank detail molded into the floor, and the steps didn't work because of the depth of the kit compartment. So I reckoned it would just be easier to replace the floor. The bottom surface of the floor was evened out to provide a base for the new floor. The center section was removed. The sides of the lower beams were covered over with 15,000 sheet, and the floor was replaced with scribe siding. Next, I wanted to establish the placement of the bulkhead at the rear of the compartment opening. As best I could figure, it lined up with the step in the lower beam. I transferred that measurement to the fuselage side. With the fore and aft dimensions of the space defined, I could create the upper box beams and something of a representation of the rails that run on either side of the compartment opening. I started by carving in a recess just under the lip of the opening. The recess measured out to be about 10 thousandths deep. A thin strip of 20,000 styrene was cemented into the recess to act as a spacer. The faces for the beams were cut from 15,000 styrene sheet. Using my previous failed attempt as a guide, I laid out the location of the lightning holes. I cut the holes on the mill. The styrene was held on the block with double-sided sticky tape. If you're drilling really thin styrene like this, it works much better to use a two-fluted end mill. Drills have a tendency to bite and pull the material up. Here you can see the design of the flutes. I don't recommend trying this with a four-fluted mill because most of the time their design doesn't function well for plunge cutting. The face for the beam was first glued in place, followed by the bottom portion. Then the excess was removed. Here you can see the simulation of the rail and recess provided by the 20,000 spacer. The sheathing was then cemented in place. The length of the upper beams got a final adjustment. The area was taped off, and hydrocal was used to pick up the internal contour of the fuselage. I explained the complete technique in this video. Because I was unsure about the symmetry of the two fuselage halves, I made a template for each side. To establish the exact alignment, the two template halves were placed back into the fuselage and then cemented together. Repeated passes with a scribe were used to cut out the bulkhead from 30,000 stock. The floor and bulkhead were then cemented into the starboard half of the fuselage. To ensure that the unsupported portion of the bulkhead would go to place against the beam in the opposite fuselage half, a small tab was cemented to the port side. Here the solid bulkhead is just functioning as a spacer. I made a quick hydrocal template to create a stencil to cut some former detail. Here are the formers in place. I took the easy way out to finish off the shelf in the front of the compartment by just using the rear portion of one of the spare cockpit inserts. It seems like the equipment that was placed in this space varied from model and dash number. This is an image from an early shop and erection manual. Here again, my only interest was just to suggest some equipment in the area and provide enough space for the sliding portion of the rear compartment canopy. If I had to do the gunner's compartment over again for the nth time, it would have been much easier and more prototypical to just remove the kit shelf and extend the beams and rails all the way back. The shelf could then be replaced between the beams in the same fashion as the prototype. With the addition of the sidewall detail, the kit skate ring no longer fit, and fabricating a new one proved to be a real challenge, especially since I was hoping to come up with a scheme to have the gunner and guns removable for painting with the front portion of the compartment canopy cemented in place. I first attempted to fabricate the skate ring from styrene strip, but it turned out to be too flimsy and difficult to work with while trying to position the other elements. This is a case where metal is a much better choice, so I milled the ring, 2 mounting brackets, and the mount assembly from brass. Initially, I thought the twin machine guns provided in the kit looked chunky, and there had to be something better, so I went looking. I compared the offerings from Accurate Miniature, Hasegawa, and Great Wall Hobbies against known dimensions. I found that they all had their own set of issues. In the end, I just decided to do a rework of the kit guns and add some master detail barrels. If you want to know more about the specifics of what I did, I put up a short video with a step-by-step process. Here are all the major pieces in place, and pretty much true to the prototype, things are a bit tight. So the gunner and guns could be removed for painting. I pinned the gunner in place. I wanted the gunner's hands around the grips, and I thought it would be better to put the split in a less visible spot and make his hands and forearms integral with the guns. I started with 12 thousandths wire, overcoated with cyanoacrylate and acrylic powder to add stiffness. To make the sculpting process easier, I created a quick jig to hold the gunner and guns. At this point, I was satisfied with what I learned about the A-20's internals, so while I was still playing Michelangelo with the gunner figure, I decided it was time to button up the fuselage. But before closing things up, I made sure to replace the side windows in the gunner's compartment. A quick template was created for cutting an oversized opening in the fuselage as well as a replacement window. The window was cut from acrylic sheet stock. I highly recommend when doing this type of window replacement, you only use a minimum of solvent cement and rely on cyanoacrylate for filling and additional reinforcement of the joint. That way you can finish it down quickly and not have a nasty surprise when the joint finally stabilizes 2 weeks after the model's completed. The acrylic was cemented slightly elevated and then sanded flush. As a guard against gouging, I always protect the surrounding area with masking tape when doing my initial reduction. This is especially important since the acrylic and cyanoacrylate filler are harder than styrene. The interior got a bit of color. Referencing the flight manual, I did a quick check of the load. Finally, the fuselage was closed up, and that also closes up the first part of the construction. So long for now, and I'll see you next time.